Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're re-diving deep into one of America's oldest and most chilling mysteries, the Lost Colony of Roanoke. We all know the basic story, right? In 1587, a group of English settlers, led by John White, established a colony on Roanoke Island. White sailed back to England for supplies, but his return was delayed by war. When he finally got back 3 years later, the colony was gone. No signs of a struggle, no bodies, just a single word carved into a post, CROATOAN, for centuries. The prevailing theory was that the colonists simply assimilated with the nearby CROATOAN tribe. It makes sense, right? They were allies, and it was a prearranged plan if they had to move. Case closed. Well, not so fast. What if the story is far more complex and bizarre than we've been led to believe? Today, we're pushing past the mainstream theories and exploring some fascinating lesser-known ideas about what really happened to those 117 men, women, and children. Let's start with a theory that sounds like something straight out of a horror movie. The colonists became victims of a rogue Spanish garrison. Now, we know Spain saw English colonization as a direct threat to its dominance in the New World. They had already attacked a French settlement in Florida years earlier, so the precedent was there. What if a Spanish patrol, operating secretly, stumbled upon the Roanoke settlement? They wouldn't have wanted to leave any witnesses or evidence of their attack, which could explain the complete disappearance. The colonists could have been captured and taken as prisoners, perhaps to Spanish colonies in Florida or the Caribbean, or worse. The CROATOAN carving could have been a desperate red herring, a false trail left by the last survivor, or even a taunt left by the attackers themselves, designed to send John White on a wild goose chase. It's a dark thought, but given the geopolitical tensions of the time, it's not entirely out of the question. Okay, let's shift gears to a theory that's less about human conflict and more about the brutal reality of the environment. This one is called the Lost at Sea theory. We know the colonists had a small ship, a pinnace for local travel and exploration. The plan John White knew about was to move 50 miles into the main, meaning inland. But what if that plan changed? What if, facing starvation and dwindling supplies, a large portion of the colonists decided their best bet wasn't to go deeper into unfamiliar territory, but to try and sail home? It would have been an incredibly desperate gamble, attempting to cross the Atlantic in a small vessel. If they did, a single storm, a common occurrence in the Outer Banks, could have wiped them all out without a trace. This would explain the lack of graves, skeletons, or any signs of a struggle on the island. The few who stayed behind might have been too weak to leave a detailed message, or perhaps they eventually succumbed to starvation, or joined the CROATOAN people, leaving only that single, cryptic clue. Now for a theory that combines historical records with a touch of political intrigue. It suggests the colonists weren't lost at all, but were deliberately disappeared by powerful figures in England. The most famous proponent of this was Sir Walter Raleigh, the colony's sponsor. The theory goes like this. What if the Roanoke colony was never meant to be a permanent settlement? What if it was just a pawn in a much larger game? Perhaps Raleigh, facing political enemies at Queen Elizabeth's court, needed the colony to fail in a spectacular, mysterious way. A lost colony would generate sympathy and perhaps secure him more funding and support for future ventures, without the messy details of an actual failure. In this scenario, the colonists might have been secretly evacuated and relocated elsewhere, perhaps back to England, or to another undisclosed location, under strict orders to never reveal their true identities. The whole CROATOAN clue and the dramatic search by John White could have been an elaborate piece of political theater. It sounds conspiratorial, but the Elizabethan court was rife with plots and backstabbing, making this theory more plausible than it might seem at first glance. Let's explore another fascinating idea that has gained some traction thanks to modern archaeology. This is the split and scattered theory. Instead of the entire colony moving as one cohesive group to CROATOAN Island, what if they broke up into several smaller groups and went in different directions? Life in the colony was likely full of factions and disagreements. Maybe one group decided to head north to the Chesapeake Bay, where they originally intended to settle. Another group might have gone south to live with the CROATOAN, as planned. And a third, smaller group might have tried to go west, deeper into the mainland. Over the years, archaeologists have found English-made artifacts from the correct time period scattered across a wide area in North Carolina. Far from both Roanoke and CROATOAN Island, these small groups, separated and isolated, would have been much more vulnerable. They would have assimilated into different native communities more quickly, their English identity fading within a generation or two. This would explain why no large, obvious settlement was ever found. They didn't move to one place. They dispersed into many, their story fracturing and disappearing into the oral traditions of various tribes. Finally, we arrive at one of the most provocative and unsettling theories, one that involves a dark secret hidden within the colony itself. What if the colonists didn't fall to an outside force, but to something that came with them? I'm talking about a virulent, fast-acting disease. A ship in the 16th century was a cramped, unsanitary placer, perfect incubator for illness. If a deadly epidemic broke out shortly after John White left, it could have torn through the small, isolated population with terrifying speed. This would account for the lack of bodies. The last few survivors, desperate to prevent the disease from spreading, and perhaps following some sort of quarantine protocol, may have systematically burned the bodies of the dead. This was a known practice in Europe during plague outbreaks. The settlement would have been abandoned not out of choice, but out of necessity and fear of contagion. The CROATOAN carving could have been a message from the very last survivor, indicating where they were heading in a desperate, final attempt to find help before they too succumbed. It's a grim picture, but it fits the eerie, silent scene that greeted John White upon his return. So, from a secret Spanish attack to a desperate ocean crossing, political conspiracy, a scattered dispersal, and a deadly epidemic, the mystery of Roanoke is far from solved. The mainstream idea of assimilation with the CROATOAN people is still the most likely. But these other theories show us just how many possibilities exist. They remind us that history is often messier, stranger, and more complex than the simple stories we're told. The truth of what happened to those 117 souls might be a combination of these theories, or something else entirely that we haven't even imagined yet. The forest keeps its secrets, and the sands of the Outer Banks have buried the truth for over 400 years. What do you think happened? Let me know your favorite theory down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's great unknowns, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss our next adventure. See you next time. Ever heard of the Lost Colony of Roanoke? Of course you have. It's one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. In 1587, a group of English settlers, including women and children, vanished from their settlement on Roanoke Island, leaving behind only a single cryptic clue: the word CROATOAN carved into a post. For centuries, the leading theory was that they assimilated with the nearby CROATOAN tribe, now known as the Hatteras people. But what if there's more to the story? What if the conventional wisdom is just the tip of the iceberg? Today, we're diving deep into the shadows of history to explore some fascinating, lesser-known theories about what really happened to the Roanoke colonists. Get ready, because this journey will challenge everything you thought you knew. Let's start with a theory that sounds like something straight out of a political thriller: the Spanish conspiracy. In the late 16th century, Spain and England were bitter rivals, locked in a struggle for dominance of the New World. The Spanish saw the English colony at Roanoke as a direct threat to their interests, a potential base for English privateers, or pirates, to raid their treasure fleets sailing from the Americas. We know for a fact that the Spanish were aware of the Roanoke settlement. They had spies in London and were actively gathering intelligence on English colonial plans. So, here's the theory. A Spanish force, either sent from Florida or directly from the Caribbean, secretly landed on Roanoke Island, captured the colonists, and wiped the settlement off the map. Why do this in secret? A public attack could have triggered an all-out war with England, a risk the Spanish might not have been willing to take, especially with the Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588. A covert operation, on the other hand, would neutralize the threat without direct consequences. The colonists could have been taken as prisoners, transported to Spanish territories, and forced into servitude or worse. The CROATOAN carving, it could have been a red herring, a deliberate piece of misdirection left by the Spanish to send John White and any future English search parties on a wild goose chase. Or perhaps a single colonist managed to carve it before being captured, a desperate last message. While there's no direct archaeological evidence of a Spanish attack on Roanoke itself, the political climate of the time makes this a chillingly plausible scenario. Now, let's venture into a theory that's a bit more speculative but is gaining traction. Thanks to modern science, extreme weather, and disease, we often imagine the colonists struggling against human threats. But what if their greatest enemy was nature itself? A team of researchers from the University of Arkansas has been studying tree rings from old-growth bald cypress trees in the Roanoke area. What they found was astonishing. Their analysis revealed that the years between 1587 and 1589 coincided with the most extreme drought the region had seen in 800 years. Imagine arriving in a new land, promised a paradise, only to be met with a relentless, crop-killing drought. The colonists' food supplies would have dwindled rapidly. They would have been unable to grow their own crops, and the local Native American tribes, also suffering from the drought, would have had little to spare. This dire situation would have made the colonists incredibly vulnerable. Malnutrition weakens the immune system, making people susceptible to diseases they might otherwise fight off. A deadly epidemic sweeping through a starved, isolated, and desperate community could have been catastrophic. In this scenario, the colony wouldn't have been lost in a single dramatic event. Instead, it would have been a slow, agonizing demise. People would have died off from starvation and sickness. The survivors, few and desperate, might have scattered in small groups, attempting to find food and shelter elsewhere, perhaps even trying to sail back to England in a makeshift boat. This theory explains the lack of bodies or signs of a struggle. The dead would have been buried, and the settlement would have slowly been reclaimed by nature. The CROATOAN carving could have been the last act of a dying community, indicating where the last few survivors were headed in a final, desperate attempt to find help. Here's another theory that puts a different spin on the assimilation idea. The mainstream theory suggests the colonists joined a friendly CROATOAN tribe. But what if they were forced to split up and integrate with multiple, even hostile, tribes? The 16th century American Southeast was a complex web of tribal politics, alliances, and rivalries. The colonists, starving and weak from the drought we just discussed, would have been in a terrible bargaining position. They might not have had the luxury of choosing their allies. According to this factional split theory, the colony didn't move as a single unit. Instead, they broke into smaller groups. Some might have gone south to live with the CROATOAN on Hatteras Island. Others might have been captured or forcibly assimilated by different inland tribes. There are tantalizing clues that support this. John Smith, of Jamestown fame, reported hearing stories from the Powhatan tribe about people living near them who dressed and lived like the English. He was even shown some objects that he believed were of European origin. Later maps, like the Zuniga map from 1607, drawn based on native intelligence, show a location deep inland, west of Roanoke, marked with a symbol for a European-style fort. Could this have been a last stand for a faction of the Roanoke colonists? Perhaps a group tried to establish a new settlement on their own, away from the coast, only to eventually succumb to the harsh realities of the wilderness or conflict with local tribes. This theory paints a picture of a fragmented, scattered diaspora, with small pockets of survivors being absorbed into the vast cultural landscape of Native America, their English identities slowly fading over generations until only legends remained. Finally, let us explore a theory that is both tragic and profoundly human: civil war within the colony itself. We tend to romanticize the colonists as a unified group of brave pioneers, but the reality was likely far more complicated. The 117 settlers were a diverse mix of people, families seeking a new life, gentlemen, adventurers, and soldiers. They were under immense pressure, isolated thousands of miles from home, facing starvation, and surrounded by unfamiliar people and environments. Tensions must have been incredibly high. Disagreements over leadership, resource allocation, and how to interact with the native tribes could have easily boiled over into open conflict. Imagine two factions forming within the settlement. One side might have advocated for a more aggressive stance, demanding food from the local tribes. The other might have pushed for diplomacy and trade. As the drought worsened and desperation grew, a violent power struggle could have erupted. This internal conflict could have led to a battle within the fort, resulting in casualties and the collapse of the colony's social structure. The survivors of this internal strife, leaderless and demoralized, might have then taken different paths. The victorious faction could have decided to seek refuge with the CROATOAN, leaving the carving as their intended destination. The losing faction might have been exiled, forced to fend for themselves in the wilderness, or been killed. This theory explains the lack of a clear battle site with an external enemy, and it acknowledges the intense psychological stress the colonists were under. It's a dark possibility, suggesting the greatest threat to the Roanoke colonists may not have come from the Spanish or the natives, but from within themselves. So, from a Spanish special ops raid to a devastating drought, from a scattered diaspora among native tribes to a brutal internal conflict, the mystery of Roanoke is far from settled. These theories, while not as widely known as the simple assimilation story, are rooted in historical context and emerging scientific evidence. They remind us that the past is complex, and often much darker and more dramatic than we imagine. The fate of those 117 men, women and children may never be known for certain. But each new theory brings us one step closer to understanding their story. What do you think happened to the lost colony? Let me know your own theories in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this dive into a historical mystery, be sure to like and subscribe for more.